Welcome, everyone, to tonight's meeting of the New York Technology Council. Delighted that you're all here. Over the 4 years that NITEC has been in existence, we've done 3 or 4 internationally oriented events. They've kind of been one-off events. And we're now starting what we hope to be a regular track of events in this area. For those of you who don't know us, we're a nonprofit industry association, entirely funded by the private sector. We're here to support the tech scene in New York and tech companies and those in the tech space. We have a number of sponsors. They are essential to our existence. It's not exaggerated to say we would not be here without them. And I want to give a special thanks to Anchin, our host tonight. So with that, let me turn things over to Bill Pierce, and he'll pick it up from there.
Good evening. Thank you very much, Eric. What we're going to do today is, the form of the presentation is not going to be a strict lecture. We're going to start out with introductions of the speakers. Then each speaker has a few slides which are very graphic and light on the words, so I'll make that easy. And we're going to have, so each speaker will have a few minutes to present the issues, the key concepts that motivate and frame the speaker's experience in the international sector for tech companies. And then we have a list of questions, which will be topics, which we'll post on the screen, and we will have a debate amongst ourselves and with you. So you are part of this experience. We invite you to share experiences, to pose questions, to invite commentary not only by us but by others in the audience, because this is really an educational experience for everyone. And my experience is that when I'm a speaker, everybody in the audience could be a speaker too, so we all have something to share. So now let's play here with the slides. So let's see if this is okay. We're good. So I'd like to introduce Michael Muth, who is a Foreign Commercial Service Officer with the U.S. Department of Commerce. And there are 2 sides of the government. One is promotes and supports the business, and the other is the ones who come and account for what happened afterwards. Michael's part of the promotion side. And what I'd like to do is, when you're ready to, I'm going to go through your slides, okay. And maybe if you want to just take a look at the slides as they come by and give us your impressions on first your background, and secondly, we'll go through the slides and then move on to the next speaker.
Sure. I guess just, well, first of all, welcome, and thank you all for coming, and special thanks to Anchin as well. I guess just to give you an idea why I'm here, I hope you don't think of me just as your typical government wonk. I've only worked for the government for about 7 months, and I'm more of a professional business guy. And in the technology area and international, I've worked for probably 15 out of the last 20 years in building international relationships for tech companies. So hopefully that qualifies me to speak about these things today. So I guess we might as well jump into this. I work for the U.S. Department of Commerce, specifically at the Export Assistance Center here in downtown New York City. So our role, our mission, I guess if you could hit it again, please, is to generate and maintain jobs by promoting small business exports of American businesses. And so a big part of the way we do that is by some of the services and things that I'll be showing you in a minute. So even though some of you may be looking for things that are different, it's important to keep our mission in mind because it keeps everything else that what we're doing in perspective. Next, please. It's also important to know about our organizational structure. If you could hit it again, please. We have a network of 72 offices around the world in all of the major metropolitan areas where we employ locally engaged staff who are industry specialists in each of those countries. And so, from your perspective, it's important to know that all these people have been working in their industry and in their countries for years. They're building connections. They have a lot of knowledge and experience in those markets, in those countries. So a big part of our role is to simply leverage their connections, knowledge, and experience in their countries for your benefit. So this shows you our coverage in the Americas. We're pretty solid, cover most of the countries, certainly all of the major markets. Next is up Europe, cover most of it there. We pulled out of Switzerland, unfortunately, not great coverage in the Balkans and the Baltics. Asia, cover all the major areas as well. And lastly, one more. Africa is the one place where we're working on building our network. We have a directive from the president to expand our operations there. We're working on it. Obviously, it's an area of growing opportunity. There are tech opportunities there, but I'll be honest, it's still primarily a lot more the developed world that is where a lot more of the opportunities lie. Next, please. So as I said, the focus of what we do revolves primarily around building strategic partnerships. If you could hit it. I don't know if you can see it, but that's an old sign that says old economy. If you look at our website, export.gov, it may look like a very old-fashioned website. And what we've done in the past for widget manufacturers, any kind of manufacturers, is use a leverage partnership approach. In other words, find partners in country through which American manufacturers can plug their products and they can sell to a large audience without investing a lot of resources. So in the past, those were distributors. Again, please, Bill. Dealers. Again, agents and representatives. Okay? So now in a new world, information age economy, hit it again, we are still taking a leverage partnership approach, but the players have changed. So in other words, now in a technology sense, instead of looking for distributors, for technology firms, we're looking for systems integrators and value-added resellers because they're the technology implementers. A lot of companies are also coming to us to build relationships with telecom companies simply because they can reach a lot of customers and it's a good channel for their products. So, if you look at our website, it's going to look old-fashioned, but please know we can build partnerships for you of this nature, and it's not restricted to just these. For example, I also work with educational organizations. Late last year, we had a mission going to India, focused specifically on healthcare education. So I was taking local schools to India to build not only relationships with other schools in India, but also with hospitals, research institutes, and even pharma companies. So when you think about partnerships, we primarily want to create partnerships that drive revenues, that create jobs. We're much more on the demand side, generating revenues and essentially building sales channels. That's opposed to the other side, which is focused on supply side, where you're building your supply chain essentially to cut your costs. So I like to think we're more the opportunity side as opposed to the cost minimization side.
So supply chain is really the opposite side. That's cost reduction. It's basically externalization of functions and buying somebody else's services. And what you're doing is you're integrating the different Americans with foreigners to build something that they would not have had alone.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you could call it the demand chain is what we focus on as opposed to the supply chain.
Okay. Next.
Please. Another way that we typically help American companies revolves around events. So we do two things. Number one, we encourage American companies to exhibit at foreign trade shows around the world. A couple of those that pertain specifically to tech companies, if you could hit it, Bill. 3. We are exhibiting at the Mobile World Congress in Barcelona, I believe this week. CeBIT, obviously in Germany, world's biggest IT show. And forgive me for getting the old logo for info security, but they're getting very proprietary about their logos, so I couldn't find a contemporary one. At these events, we will have a U.S. pavilion. You can participate very cost effectively. We also host other buyers and recruit people to come to your exhibit and organize meetings. So we bring customers to you, and it's all at a greatly discounted price, so we try and make it a good deal. On the other side, we also bring foreign buyers to shows here in America where you're exhibiting. So Infocom, taking place in Orlando, I believe in June, is one such show. And so again, buyers coming in from all over the world, and you partner with us, we make appointments for you with all these foreign buyers coming to the States. One more, please, Bill. Also supporting the CTIA show for wireless. Next, please. We also do have some free online marketing research, which can be valuable. We have a fair amount of tech things on there. I'll be honest though, as the government, our resources are constrained, and we haven't had as much time and resources to devote to it. So some of this is getting kind of outdated, but the bottom line is it's still for free. And so I went on and checked a lot of our market research reports that came out in January 2014. We've got a lot of them in Latin America, Brazil, Mexico, Argentina, Colombia, I forget where else, giving you best prospect reports. In other words, specific segments that are in highest demand. Another difference with our organization, and again, it kind of reflects our bit of an old-fashioned mentality, it still focuses very much on hardware, telecom equipment, those kinds of things. We're still transitioning to information, services, those kinds of things. So please don't let that put you off if you're thinking about working with us. We can work with those kinds of companies. It's just looking at our website, it's always not apparent. Next, please. So lastly, just want to give you a couple reasons why you might want to think about working with us. First of all, the premise is, I know a lot of technology companies think you can do everything over the web and try and minimize your labor costs and in some ways minimize the human contact and simply automate everything. I can give you 3 reasons where we can help. Number 1, I don't know if you can read that, but it simply refers to resources. In other words, you can do a lot of cold calling, mine email addresses, maybe even get telephone numbers of a lot of influential decision makers. You can spend a lot of time banging on doors, but it takes time to do that, and thinking about time to market and those kinds of things, we have long-standing people in their industries in countries. And so we can simply get you in faster. And so even paying us for some of our services, and we do charge a little bit, it's usually on the scale of hundreds of dollars as opposed to thousands that private consultants would charge. In many cases, making those hundreds of dollars of investments is a good investment for you, simply from a resource perspective. Next, please, Bill. Number 2, government contracts. A lot of IT firms are going after government business around the world, and one of the best ways to get government contracts is through other governments. We help you there. We have what's called an advocacy center, where we explicitly help and promote American firms get foreign government contracts. Next, please. Lastly, kind of ironic that a guy on his computer screen is saying we should have more personal contact, but in some ways I think that mirrors what goes on in technology companies a bit. As I was alluding to earlier, not only will it take you a lot of time from a resource perspective in some ways to overcome obstacles and reach the right people, because we have people working for the US government, we can simply get into some people that you might not ever be able to get into. And so simply from a personal contact perspective, we can make some that you can't. And in some ways that's worth paying a little bit for. So that's pretty much what we do. I will look forward to the conversation and questions as we move forward.
We'd like to thank you, Michael Muth. That was great, because one of the questions I like to ask is, what are you doing that other people are not doing? What are other people doing? And how do we have a competitive American government for promoting American services and technology? And what should we be doing? Which is something which may be a political section for you, but maybe the rest of us can talk about.
Do you want to get into that now or later?
A little bit later.
Okay, good.
Thank you. So,
Oh, I'm sorry, that's just my applause. My contact information is on the last slide here.
I gotta click everything now.
There we go.
Okay.
That's where you can reach me. I look forward to getting in touch.
Okay, so I'll leave that on the screen for a moment now. Thank you very much, Michael Muth. I'd like to move on now to Michael Waxman-Lenz, who is an experienced entrepreneur, and he's got some road wear on his back, and he's been to some different countries, some difficult places to work. He's also engaged in setting up companies offshore to expand a global network of technology companies. He's had significant experience in building and adjusting to market conditions, which is actually one of the challenges of every entrepreneur. Fine, so Michael Waxman-Lenz from International Education Advantage, LLC.
So we're actually not going to talk about the company that I started a few years ago with a partner. I've been going in and out of the big corporate to small corporate. I started with a partner, my first internet company in 1994. And so, you know, when we gave presentations to senior people at firms like Pricewaterhouse, you got the comments and you know, I have to ask my son what this is all about, this internet stuff. So it was we've gone through a really interesting time in terms of technology. I spent, the danger with working internationally is always that you condense everything to the best 12 anecdotes that you think are the 12. The same, like I served in the German army, and so you know you put everything back to the 6 best anecdotes. But if you can go to the next slide, I want to talk a little bit more about the soft side. So as a former finance person, I thought, you know, I'm really qualified talking about the soft side of business and the cultural elements. But first I wanted to go back to what Michael said in terms of the type of partnerships. And I have 3 buckets in my head when I think of international partnerships. One is more distribution partnerships, sales channels, content distribution. I spend a lot of time in internet where it's about distribution partnerships. The second is more outsourcing in terms of kind of what we talked about, the supply chain. You know, what kind of partners do you pick? And the third one for me, which may be not as relevant for you, were content partnerships. Where do we get content, right, that we needed for the type of companies I was managing? But these were very distinct, different types of relationships, and you focus on different things. And I picked this picture for a reason, because you have to decide with whom do you swim together and how big are these partners. We, for example, in one company, I worked with American Greetings Corporation for almost 10 years, managing the digital business. We had a partnership with Microsoft. Now, we worked for Microsoft in 16 different international markets. We managed websites for them. Now, I can assure you, Microsoft has every ability to do that. But they chose to outsource that to us because it was more convenient, it was easier, we had a very focused expertise, but it allowed us to get into markets that we could have otherwise not possibly gotten in as easily. And so, you know, I would put Microsoft kind of as the shark and us as the small fish next door, but it was a very symbiotic relationship that worked. On the other hand, for others, right, we would have been, as a $100 million business, we would have been a really large company because these were small tech startups, and they were at awe when we had 50 programmers on something, and we never had enough resources. However, you have to always look at the relative relationship between those and what you do with them. If we go to the next. This picture is kind of the similar theme, right? Who's taken whom by the hand? Right? We went into Europe, and I don't know, who does work here in Europe right now? All right, so we bought a company with 5 different offices in 5 different countries. And you know, we bought this company basically to help us get into telecom relationships and others, because we felt without the local contacts, it was pretty much not possible. Now, I can also assure you it didn't work out. We bought the company, and I was involved in buying the company and to shut it down 18 months later. And it takes a long time to shut down companies in Europe. By the way, I can say that I grew up in Germany. I'm one of those German, or one of those immigrants here to the US via graduate school. But it's really important to think about, right, who can support whom. It's wonderful to think about working with France Telecom, you know, but you have to have a certain wherewithal to work with companies that are as large, right? It is just there's bureaucracy, there are long processes. If you're a small startup, and believe me, right now I work with universities, which if this is recorded, I get in trouble. They work very slowly at a very deliberate pace. As a smaller company, you have to be able to sustain that pace in terms of cash flow, in terms of deal flow, right? So that relationship can only work if you're both aligned to some extent. Well, this is my culture slide. Culture still matters. Right? Different traditions. I worked in the former Soviet Union for 5 years. I was not a good drinker, which was a real problem. My staff tried to protect me, with I had kidney disease or whatever. It was culturally not accepted. There are a lot of cultural nuances to doing business. And any of us traveling around the world, I would not underestimate them. And I have lots of examples from managing a venture capital fund in Central Asia, working with lots of international companies, right? We are very straightforward, and I have a dual citizenship now. So I say that as Americans, even as Europeans, we are incredibly direct. When you go into Asia, it takes much longer, right? And again, good and bad stories about that, but culture matters, and it starts with food. How we eat here in the US may not be well respected when you sit in France or in Germany at a table. But it has a perception of how you are respected and how people trust you. I would never underestimate this, even though I work in a digital technology world. We do lots of stuff via Skype and GoToMeeting. It still matters. It still matters. All right?
Michael, who are these people here? Do we know any of these people?
Oh, I can't. Please,
The one on the left, for those of us who are not from New York, is that our mayor?
Yes. Our staff found this and made sure that I knew it was the mayor, not a European guy. And I said, all right, good.
Okay.
What?
Who's the one on the right?
That's our president.
I thought so. I didn't want to
Yeah. No, absolutely. And you would never find the German chancellor eating this way in public. All right. Not even more serious. One of my experiences was, where are all the lawyers here in this room? Bill? I'm going to say that before Bill gets to speak. They talk past each other very easily, right? These legal traditions, again, matter. And Bill can talk to this a lot more, right? Europe has a very different legal traditions. Agreements can be much shorter than with American lawyers. And, American lawyers, given our case law tradition, spell out everything. And it drives Europeans or Russians or nuts. For Chinese, they don't care anyway. And I'm going to use stereotypes, right? Because the written contract is just signed, and then you start negotiating when you start your business. So again, I'm using stereotypes to make the point, right? But legal traditions matter. And when you do deals, right, and you have different traditions and lawyers involved, you just have to work through that, right? And having advisors that understand both traditions is really important because they can help you maneuver through this. As a business person, right, you need that advice, but you pay dearly if you don't have the right construct with people that understand those things. So enough lawyer bashing here. It was not really meant this way, but it's really about the cultural context.
I heard lawyer appreciation.
More than I usually give, absolutely. All right, the last one, a topic that people really don't like to talk about. And when my wife and I came back after 5 years in Russia, and we would constantly talk about bribes and payments, our friends would say, "What's wrong with you?" And I said, "Look, we lived for 5 years where you are concerned. Are you driving or are you driving? Because if I drive, as a Westerner, I would get stopped by the police and I would pay or my car would be impounded. So either my driver would drive or my wife, who's a white Caucasian who speaks Russian fluently, and the Central Asian policemen wouldn't know what to do with her. So they would leave her alone. But that matters. And if you do business in many countries, and I'd say, outside Western Europe, there are things that need to be solved. Now, we as Americans are in a particularly challenging situation because of our regulatory environment. But believe me, I sat in front of very high-level ministers in Russia that yelled at me as a 27-year-old, saying what an idiot I am, that I wouldn't pay $50,000 to renovate the conference room. from the money that we had available from the US government in this case. And I said, because it would be the end of my career. And they said, you don't get it. This is how you get business done here. This is how we help you. So these are not comfortable situations. They're actually quite uncomfortable. And these people can make your life miserable. When your equipment is stuck in customs, in many countries, every family wants somebody in customs because it's a very profitable part of the government for the individuals. So, this is a reality, whether we have a law, the Anti-Corruption Act or not, in countries, you have to get business done. I'm not condoning, and I've fought bribery for many, many years, but it's a reality of doing international business. It's a reality of having relationships. It's a reality of the partners you pick that can get you in trouble or can help you. And it's something, it's hard to find in a textbook, and nobody can give you a solution for it. You have to make your way through it. And the rule is you don't make payments. And then you go from there.
I won't ask you whether you have ever made a payment.
I have not. I have not. But I had lots of local partners. I don't know how they got it done.
You don't want it.
And I don't want to know.
Okay. Thank you, Michael Waxman-Lentz. I really appreciate the comparison between our president and our mayor. So, my name is Bill Bierce, and I'm an international business lawyer. I do a lot of work with foreign companies coming to the United States looking for ways to extend their market. There's a lot of sales, development, agreements. But actually what we find is I'm finding more ways in which foreign companies and American companies find ways to partner where one has technology, one has capacity to deliver services or to extend that technology or to provide markets for the technology or to develop jointly. So we're here tonight because we want to explore some of the ways in which people partner and the issues and experiences we've all had in partnering. I think some of you have had good experiences in bed, and I think what we'd like to do is experience some of those ways and make them explicit as to how we develop, in this case, we'll call them offshore tech partnerships for international expansion, both direct and indirect, both inbound and outbound. Now, how many of you ever rowed in your career? Yes? Nobody? We have some oarsmen. Okay, great. So this picture here means something to those of us who've had to deal with finding the way to work together. And you can still maintain your own independence, but it's within a certain limited framework. So what I find interesting about this picture and the slide, the concept, is that we all have our own core business, and at the same time, we can't do it all ourselves. And we need to find people, and whether we own them or not, whether we finance them or not, we need to find ways to work together so that it works for both. I don't want to call it win-win because win-win has been abused. Basically, a matter of interest analysis. Everyone has a self-interest in seeing the success of the joint enterprise and not to tear it apart and to disappoint its opportunities. So if you look at it this way, then you look at your jigsaw puzzle of life and you have certain opportunities that you couldn't do alone, and you find you're looking for ways to team up with someone who can provide that to you in a manner where you're borrowing their resources and they're borrowing your resources, and together you're creating something which you could not do individually. And that's the challenge of alignment. So we're going to talk a little bit about, this is sort of one of my core slides, is that what are the ways you develop business alliances? You do it by contract, which is where you just do it for a term of a period. Or you do it as an entity, which theoretically goes on forever. But as with every business alliance, you need to plan for ways in which you can deal with changes in circumstances, changes in management, changes in market conditions. So that's the exit plan. Each one of these has an exit plan. Now, my particular interest is I've done a lot of both the outsourcing, which is the supply chain, and here you also have value chain, where, for example, you do joint R&D, you do a spin-off of a university that gives a license to a university patent. Someone from the university leaves the university, creates a company. That company has a limited amount of resources, but it gets an exclusive license to the technology. It then goes to the marketplace and says, I have the technology. Who would like to help you market this and support it with contracts? Do they have the marketing clout? Do they have the service delivery capacity? And let's team up together. So there are different ways in which you can team up together. The critical factor is how tightly are you married, and under what conditions can you split. These are different ways, and you can get going on all these different structures. I imagine, actually some of these, the merger and amalgamation, I just put together a 3-country deal, Canada, US, and UK, where we set up a holding company in UK, and that company was then the parent of the different operating companies. And what they did is they created their own group consolidation rather than do M&A. They just said, well, let's do it tax-free. And so that'll build out their resources together. They can then go to market as presenting a bigger footprint. They can then get more resources for volume discounts from the providers. And they can also set up their own back office where they can manage it better, more efficiently than the individual company might be able to do so. So that's sort of an amalgamation. I've even seen situations where 35 bars, evaluated resellers, come together under one trademark. They each own a company that owns a trademark, but that's all the company owns. They license the trademark to themselves. They sell themselves as We Are US Connect. And they basically had 35 different shops doing different functions in different cities. And they extended that for about 10 years, and it was a great exit strategy because after 10 years, they're all happy. They got the name brand valued up. They had volume, and they sold off their different companies to the same buyer for a huge number, and they got a nice multiple. So there are different ways of partnering without owning, or you can co-own. They're sort of virtual, you're franchising yourself, and you create your franchise. And so anyway, so then we're talking about governments as partner. I think one of the things that, how many here are foreign people looking to do business with Americans? Yes? And how many are, I'll say, Americans looking to do business offshore? Okay, so it's about half, and I'd say 1/3, 1/3. The other third doesn't have anything. So the government role is pretty important, and it can help. And I think a lot of us don't really appreciate how significant the government can help you. It promotes, but it also regulates. It creates a business environment. It creates something called public policy, things you can and can't do. It requires, gives you a forum for litigation, gives you prohibitions on things you can't do, export controls, Foreign Practices Act, anti-terrorist, specially designated nationals you can't do business with, and making sure your technology is not going to fall into the wrong hands. So all those things which you sort of think about in the domestic side, you don't think about in the domestic side, you have to think about internationally. And just one other thing for the Americans who think that they have some kind of technology that might have a military or public policy impact, if you disclose that to a foreign person in this room, that's the same thing as exporting it subject to export controls without a license. So that may not be a good idea. On the other side, on the tools, one of the things we lawyers do, you think about lawyers, you've had to travel around to many different places. But the first thing they teach you in civil procedure is forum shopping. You look for the right judge. In this case, the corporate and the tax people look for the right tax jurisdiction, and for the place which will give you a combination of all the benefits you want with a minimum overhead. So forum shopping is an essential part of finding the right place. Michael Waxman, can you talk to me about Holland and your experience in Holland?
before we bought this European company that I was alluding to, we thought this would be a profitable venture. So we set up a legal entity in the Netherlands in order to flow all the royalties through this entity to save, to have significant tax savings. The trouble was, I told you, we shut it down 18 months later. So the fees that I paid to the lawyers and the offshore management were for naught. And it takes you 24 months to unwind a legal entity and do all this. So, you know, sometimes you prepare and you don't need it. But
So were you forum shopping?
indeed,
Okay. Did it have great opportunities for you?
that's what we thought.
That's what you thought, okay. Fine, so the forum actually, you think about it, it provides the operational framework, the entity organizational structures, tax structures, possibilities for inversion, moving your company from one place to another in terms of where your your headquarters is. Other things we do with tools is we do choice of law. So if you're stuck with an American company and a foreign company doing business, then you fight about the choice of law. And each case will be enforceable because there's a reasonable connection, so therefore it's not against public policy. What courts don't like is you choose the law of a third country that has no relationship whatsoever to the business transaction. So when you're going to do your business, you're stuck with the laws of the foreign jurisdiction to the extent that they have public policy rules that override even the voluntary choice of American law or the other foreign law that's related. So it's not just the contractual choice, but when you're reviewing something, you need to understand what's unenforceable. Let's talk about a foreign country on the West Coast called California. So how many of you have ever signed a non-compete covenant? Okay, non-compete covenant. And so a non-compete covenant is enforceable in New York, but not enforceable in California unless it's in connection with the sale of your shares and stock options in this new tech company you're working for. So if I have nothing about choice of law, or if I sign California law or New York law and the person's working in California, I've just made a big mistake. So you really need to work in collaboration. I think it's a very important point that you made, Michael Waxman, is work with someone who's got both sides of the issues. Tax advantages, we have people here who do tax. I mean, I think we're not here to educate too much on tax because it's very complicated. But I'd just like to point out a couple of things on tax strategies. In the international sector, you have one of the highest goals is to defer tax. Don't pay tax today, pay tax tomorrow. So there are ways to do that by setting up entities and structuring intercompany relationships and having transfer pricing between affiliates. Second thing is you'd like to get exempt if you can from tax. New York State has a Startup New York. How many of you know about Startup New York? Think it's going to be any good? We'll see. We'll talk about that. Low tax and high tax jurisdictions, people do arbitrage. So these are tax structures. You can get very complex very quickly. The Netherlands is not a low tax jurisdiction, but they have some pretty fancy stuff, which makes it a low tax jurisdiction within the EU. Very fancy. And then most important thing is you want to protect the capital gains tax treatment for everything. So you want to make sure that your income is long-term capital gain, not short-term capital gain or ordinary income. So you can still do those in international. And in the tools there are tax treaties, there are government tax agreements, and business planning you can do. So one of the things that I find most fascinating is I've spent a huge amount of time in the space of outsourcing and insourcing and strategic alliances. And what really, all of this is basically the same thing. It's workforce management, workforce planning, where you're going to get your resources, your innovation, who's going to be doing work for you, and why are you having them do that work. I think that's really the challenge for everyone, to get the good right allocation of workforce that meets both the customers and the organizational requirements. And foreign labor laws we talked about just briefly. Effectively, when foreigners come to the United States, they're shocked at how easy it is to fire someone. And Americans likewise going offshore get shocked at how long it takes and the problems and the costs. And also one little point in Europe, the Acquired Rights Directive means that if I'm an employee and I'm working for a European company and that company gets acquired or the work gets outsourced, I get to do the same work, the same compensation, the same emoluments, because that's a right granted to me under the European Union Acquired Rights Directive, which has been around for 20 years. So if you think you're going to move the work around, you really need to think about where am I going to have my source of innovation, and sometimes it's going to be outside that EU, or it might be within the EU, but only for a certain area of function, because new ventures you want to be able to have that flexible as to your workforce. Let's see. Okay, so. Intellectual property management, I think those are important issues. Consumer protections, we can go over those. So this is my end of slide. I've got that bio in the beginning, so I'll now move on to the next questions. So now let's talk about these are the topics tonight. We could go on and on. Business schools teach this for three-hour credits for how many semesters? How many weeks a semester? So let's do it real quickly. Does either of you have any comments on an experience you have in a strategic alliance internationally that worked well and one that failed?
Question, comment?
Yes, right here. Question.
Well, I actually had been quite enthusiastic at one point about partnering the Chinese investor. And I met with a PhD JD who had impeccable credentials. She had worked for, and this is not to be quoted, Johnson & Johnson in their portfolio area, and she trained at Columbia. And she told me point blank that in China, one is expected to bribe the judges, and I made it quite clear I would not do that. And her reply was, you don't have to worry, the law firm will do that for you. Now that's not acceptable to me on a personal, ethical level. And I don't believe in the US that's legally acceptable. That's considered bribery and racketeering.
Okay, so when you have to bribe the judge.
It's odious, it's reprehensible, it's not acceptable on an ethical level. Yet, this was someone who was chair of the IP legal group at a major law firm who was dealing with China's sovereign investment fund level. So at this point, and also there's been quite a bit published about the loss of revenue to the US based on cannibalization of IP rights, but this has left me with a very sour experience about dealing with China. So on the one hand, these are extremely lucrative markets. On the other hand, the IP rights are very difficult to protect, and the ethical issues are really very difficult. So what are your suggestions?
So the question is, what are the suggestions for a company that would like to take advantage of business opportunities in China? Well, if you're General Electric, you give up the rights to technology and your high-speed trains or your turbines, so that can be manufactured in China, and you're training your successor in a joint venture where at the end of a term you get kicked out and the state-owned enterprise becomes your competitor. Right. So that's an exit plan that you understand. Okay. Now that's unfortunately that's happened with Japanese trains and American automobiles and American other technologies. So lesson number one is, if you would like to have some trade secrets, protect them as trade secrets. What does that mean? Keep them secret. Don't disclose to people who don't have a need to know, and don't disclose to people who are untrustworthy. And choose your partners. Okay, so you choose, and but you're missing out on the market, right? You're upset about the market. Is that a market where you'd like to set up your competitor?
Not any longer. Not after that meeting.
Okay.
But we're giving up a huge market.
Well, it's a captive market. Okay, you're giving up a huge market, but you're also giving up your future by giving away your technology.
So, yeah.
Okay, so your question is, how fast will this technology become obsolete? And can you continue to be at the level of the innovation curve ahead of the Chinese?
My
If you
other
disclose it?
question is, a law firm, a head of an IP practice law firm telling a company that you have to bribe a judge. I mean, this apparently is not unique to my company. This, I'm sure, is expected practice. So do you advise your clients?
Who's been asked this question about bribing Americans, bribing officials? So actually, the illegality in bribes is under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in the U.S. And if you want to get your furniture out of the customs unit, that's really not a bribe. It's an expediting payment, because sooner or later that furniture will come out. And the exercise of administrative discretion is merely when. So that's a grease payment, and that's permitted under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. But if this judge has discretion in anything relating to your rights or obligations, then that's a bribe.
So do we let the attorney deal with this, basically? Do we hire a law firm and say, you deal with it, I don't want to know about it?
Well,
It's your standard, it's yours.
That's
It's
you-
how you do business here, it's a bit how you do business elsewhere. I mean, it's a judgment call, right? That's,
you want a recommendation on how to avoid the law which you know is being broken?
No.
So I think you're in a difficult position.
Well, yeah, I mean,
Any Chinese here? We have Chinese people here? Yes, sir.
There are company which were very successful and they don't bribe. Well, just many different ways of doing things. So it's not necessarily. Yeah, sometimes you deal with some people. They maybe make it like a condition you have to pay them for something. They don't have to. There's companies, private companies. They don't mind you. They don't really make money for like a cash payment, like a bribery. They make money by make profit. So if you deal with a private company, it's just like deal with a company in the United States. You just make whether that makes sense for them. Will help them to make money.
Okay, thank you.
there's somebody in the back.
Any in the back?
I just wanted to say, if anybody thinks in China or in India, you can really do it without paying somebody. I mean, somebody has to do that dirty work. Otherwise, it just won't move. If you really think it will ever move, never. It has to be paid. Means you can take the step that Michael said, that I don't want to know about it. That's great. But if you think that you can do it without making the payment, I would really.
So I'm still on point one here on strategic alliances. So your strategic alliance is with someone who's corruptly bribing foreign officials. Is that correct?
No, I'm not saying that. It depends on your choice. Do you want to get the market or not? And in a place like that, and especially in Asia, where garments are very powerful, it's a licensed garage, you have to make the payment. Somebody has to do it. It doesn't have to be you.
Yeah, okay.
Somebody has to.
All right, fine, let's move on to.
excuse me, can I just make a couple quick comments? Number one, dealing with technology companies for a long time in places like China, there's a risk to going there and there's a risk to not going there. And the risk to going there is you lose your IP. The risk to not going there is a competitor does great, and you fall behind your competitor. And so what you would describe sounds like it may be violating the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. But I am certainly not an advocate of doing any of that. But again, it's simply a risk balancing kind of question. Risk to go in there and a risk not to go in there.
So one of the due diligence items is, what's your partner's tolerance for recommending that some certain local bribes take place? And what's your tolerance for that? You have a question here?
I would just suggest for her question, I mean, find a better, more reputable law firm. I mean, if I was talking to a lawyer and they suggested that, I mean, that would be the first cue that you're talking to the wrong law firm.
This is a huge law firm.
I mean, it doesn't matter. She's one person within the law firm, and she's
Sizes and everything.
She's trying to bring in business, and you have to look at that as, if she's willing to throw that out that quickly in talks, then I mean,
She was just being open. I think.
Yeah, I mean, there are no easy answers here. And I mean, if you look at Transparency International, they have a corruption index. And I guess what was surprising to me, I taught for a year in India, and India is, I won't say better or worse or higher or lower, it's just India's significantly more corrupt than China, which kind of surprised me. And it's part of the environment. And so it goes with the whole package.
I've been told the same thing with Russian
No question.
technology outsourcing. I mean, it seems to be endemic.
Well, part of it is simply a developmental issue, and we can't get into all that, but it's a given. And
Okay.
it's a cultural thing we can't get beyond.
Thank you. So that was also part, Mr. Chinese
No, I
gentleman here.
have my question.
You have a question?
You're ready for the next question.
Yes, sir.
You mentioned the military sometimes, have, some regulations, governing that area. But there's industry which has dual application, for example, aviation industry. Technology could be used for civilian, for general aviation, but it may also applicable for military airplanes. In such a situation, it's kind of difficult. And also, if people left the company, would that person free to do works with just for civilian contract?
This is a very great question. This is a question about the transience of knowledge and proprietary information and trade secrets. So the question is, you have aircraft industry has military and civilian dual use. Maybe some of the technology may be subject to export controls depending upon the nationality of the person receiving the information or the person giving the information. And the location of where it's delivered. Then the technology has another problem because the individual who receives the information leaves and goes to work for a competitor. So I think your question is what happens then? What's your question?
For example, Boeing has many joint efforts, the IMD project with Chinese counterparts. So they could, do joint development to build together, for certain airplanes, whatever, But so I thought that should be okay, right?
Well, so this should be okay in the sense of legal and agreeable and no
Yeah.
problems with export control. So what happens is that if you export dual-use technology, you need to get a license. Some licenses are granted automatically because they're not considered a threat. But where you do need a special license, the conditions of the license are they are disclosed under certain restrictive conditions. So you have that restriction. Now, one of the things that we as lawyers and as business people worry about is how do I protect that technology from leaving the company which I'm authorized to give it to, because the employee leaves the company. And so you have the volatility of employment because that's a leakage of the knowledge. So, and we have the same issue in India. I want to outsource something to India. I give technology, I give my specifications, and the Indians are supposed to cook up some software for me, or the Chinese. So then the person leaves the employment of the person I'm doing business with. First issue is the local law sufficiently strong to enforce the rights of the original owner of the intellectual property? And what is necessary in India is you have a direct contract, I'm told, is to have a direct contract with the individual who receives your technology, so you can follow that person around and you have something called privity of contract, privity of relationship, direct relationship. So when you're contracting, you're taking your technology abroad, don't think just about that having this relationship with the company will be enough. Think about how they manage that, just like you do for your stuff, and keep it proprietary and enforce those rights. Michael Waxman, any questions? Any comments on that? Thank you. Okay. So trade secrets, patent trolls. We'll we'll jump on that. Comparative consumer protections for software as a service, mobile and cloud. This is a regulatory part. Effectively, when you take your technology, how many of you have web-based SaaS services that go off to the world? SaaS worldwide. Good. SaaS worldwide. So do you think you're violating any laws today? Maybe. Yeah, you might. I'm probably violating some laws today because there are conflicts of laws. And your issue, therefore, is to find ways to not violate foreign public policy. So you have to identify what that might be, mitigate the risk, and find ways to localize in a nice, friendly jurisdiction where the users have to consent to enforcement in that jurisdiction and the application of the law where you are. So it's not just about signing up and putting out your existing terms and conditions on the web. You need to think about things where you're going to get have the European Data Protection Directive, and that's being it's not good enough, I think, anymore. The Europeans are getting angry with Google and other people who challenge
the U.S. government.
And the U.S. government for inadequate enforcement of things which effectively give geolocalization information to get down to personal information one-to-one, and that's what we're doing. So if you're looking to do one-to-one, do it in a way where you're not invading privacy. You might, that could be a question whether you're doing meta tagging or whether we're just tracking the geolocations. There's statutes in the United States which are pending. It's called Do Not Track Me Online. That's a federal law, not signed yet. California has a public policy. They've adopted it. It says do not track me online, but they're not going to say you can't track online. You just have to declare what your public policy, your privacy policy is on the do not track online. So you could say we do cookies, we do geolocation, we spy on you. That's our policy, and it's okay in California. Okay.
Excuse me, if I could just add a point. I think I saw in the paper earlier this week that Dilma Rousseff in Brazil is getting together with the Europeans to try and build a pipe under the Atlantic specifically to avoid data and possibly even packets flowing through the U.S. and keeping their information out of the hands of the NSA and so on. I don't know if they can really do that, but that's the lengths that they're going to try and avoid sharing data here in America.
Well, actually, that's an interesting case. I had a case of an Argentine fellow, a Spanish guy who was sending something to his sister in Argentina. He spent over $10,000 in cash. FedEx. So, you know where FedEx stops? Nashville, Tennessee. Think they have any X-ray machines that look for cash? Sure do. So, you don't declare it, it's confiscated. So I got hired to get some money back. That's crazy. So anyway, think about it. And the point about the data packets going through the United States, it creates a jurisdictional link. So when you're playing international, think about how you manage your jurisdictional links. The cloud is the really worst situation. Where is my data? Is it in Russia? Is it in China? Is it in EU? And once I send it to the EU, then it comes back to me, and then my EU data provider is violating EU law because it's the policies that I have in the United States don't meet those of the EU.
It's not in China.
Pardon?
They have a pretty good firewall.
Yeah, okay, fine. Ask Google's operation there.
Yeah, and again, just to follow up, I mean, in case you haven't followed it, from what I understand, national governments are requiring that you store data from their country in that country. And so essentially it's making a global cloud impossible.
Yeah, it's a cartelization of the internet. We had one question over here and then a second question over here.
Sorry,
Yes,
just
sir.
a quick dumb question about the localization of the cloud. So you really literally mean where the server sits?
Yes. Where the server sits is where you get jurisdiction and where you get applicable law.
But for most companies of a certain size, it's irrelevant, right? And you have to tell you, right, you can host with Amazon. I can pick the server in Singapore or US or so, move it around, right? Where it gets tricky, when we bought a company in the UK, for example, with, I don't remember at the time, 500,000 subscribers, and we were moving the servers to the United States.
Yep.
We had to ask every single subscriber to re-opt in order to get payment. Now, that's not something you want to do, right? But we were forced to do that because we moved it out of Europe, and we did it because we didn't want to deal with all the privacy rules and all the separation of operations for digital marketing. That's why we wanted to move it over here.
So you needed an escape. I need your informed consent to escape from your future informed consent.
I mean, the safe harbor rules have changed a little bit, but it's still, I mean, those things, but for most entities, right? I mean, the cloud is the cloud, right? Where it gets messy is if you have lawsuits or you have other things, that's when you really deal for the first time with those things. Otherwise, you host it, you use third-party services. I mean, nobody of us knows where those servers sit when you use a third-party hosting provider.
Okay, let's move on to the next point. So the next point is on different models for U.S. business operations, ownership, incentive compensation, customer relationship, and venture funding. So Michael Waxman, you've been to Russia, you've been to Central Asia, you've been, I suspect, to Holland.
I used to live next door. Yeah.
Okay, and you've been in Germany a little bit. Can you talk a little bit about how, when you structure a U.S. business and you apply the same principles to a foreign company, that it doesn't work?
Legal structure?
Yeah, legal business structure. Like the incentive compensation, you have a qualifying stock option plan here that meets U.S. rules. Is that any good in anywhere else?
No. I mean,
Is it a waste? Is it a waste?
Well, you have to deal with compensation and other things according to local law, right? Many times it has to do with labor law. So, I mean, each country will have its own legal and business traditions, how you compensate people. Like in Germany, when you start working, you get 6 weeks vacation. Can you raise your hand who has 6 weeks of paid vacation here in this room? Good for you. My French thought, you're French, all right, good. We're gonna list the other benefits. No, I mean, that's the reality, right? I mean, in a company, and by the way, your American colleagues said, what do you mean we're giving the French employees 6 weeks vacation and we're giving them 18 months severance at a very low level because that's the government rule. There's nothing you can do, and the legal structures are just part of that.
So actually, when you're thinking about your structure for incentive compensation, just think that your employee pool, the stock option pool in the United States really should be focused on U.S. employees, and you find different ways to incentivize sweat equity in foreign countries to the extent that they can be incentivized that way. Okay. International tax planning?
Excuse me, Bill,
Yes,
if
sir.
I could just come back and contrast the organizational structure issue with alternatives to specific legal structures. In other words, part of what we do is provide indirect channels. And so in some ways you don't even have to form your own legal entity in particular countries, but then you have a little bit different trade-off. In other words, if you want to form your own organization in different places throughout the world, that has a couple advantages. Number one, it gives you control over all of your customer relationships, and long term, it usually enables you to minimize your risk because you have more control and you have much more direct relationships with all your customers. Alternatively, in working with technology companies, a lot of times they find it very attractive to be able to work through partners. And by working through those partners, it gets you much quicker access to customer bases, and in many ways it pushes off some of that risk to the partners in country. And so, these are alternatives to forming your own legal structures, but again, it creates a different set of questions. Are you interested in long-term profitability and probably higher startup costs, but maybe longer low-term costs, versus getting into a market quickly, essentially pushing customer relationships off onto your partners, but generating a lot of profitability quicker too? So, just an alternative.
With the long-term risk of?
You could be creating a competitor, conceivably, but there are many companies who still have long-term successful relationships as well. So it depends on who they are.
So let's talk about relationship governance.
Mm-hmm.
That's something which every strategic alliance really needs to talk about. It's more than just if you have a problem, low-level we'll talk about it, and then mid-level we'll talk about it, and CEOs will talk about it. How many of you have ever negotiated a governance provisions in any contract. Relationship governance. I'm not talking about board of bylaws. I'm not talking about employment. I'm talking about between organizations. Okay. Okay. We have an expert in the back. He's okay. So Eric, actually, the relationship governance is one of the hardest things to define because it really is to try to avoid the exit or the conflict that arises when two organizations are doing the mating dance and they're doing work together and they find something had occurred which they didn't see. It's sort of like, oops, I never thought of that. And so the biggest issue in your international sections, the cultural issues that Michael Waxman was talking about, how we eat pizza, we might offend somebody, or how we do analysis and submit projections for budget planning, and how we work on targeting a market. All of those need to be worked through. This is the hard part of international business, and it's the hard part of any business, but it's even harder when you have the culture, the time zone, and the regulatory frameworks and everything else. So think about this. If you want to set up alliances, great. You have a lot of learning to do. And that's okay, because you're now a global entrepreneur, whether you like it or not. Michael?
I'm sorry, I don't mean to be barging in, but have an interesting point. Attended an event on corporate governance in Japan, and apparently they have some big problems simply because they simply don't have a lot of the resources devoted to accounting that we do here in America. So for example, I found that they have as many accountants in the state of Illinois as they do in the whole of the country of Japan. And as a result of that, they don't get good reporting. And in addition to that, the corporate governance is governed a lot by culture. So in other words, you go to a board of directors meeting and it's vastly different in Japan than it is here in, say, America and possibly even Europe. In other words, a lot of the cultural stereotypes that you hear about Japanese extend to the boardroom as well. And so very non-confrontational, consensus decision-making. And in many ways in a boardroom, that's not always necessarily appropriate. You need some dissent and the ability to disagree and so on. And so just wanted to add a quick cultural example of differences in corporate governance.
Thank you. I had one Japanese deal where we were doing a distribution agreement in the United States, a sales agency, and it took them 2 years to do the contract because of the Rinky consensus building. They were also trying to screw the American sales agent, that I understand. But it took them 2 years to go from the bottom of the line to the top of the head and to have them approve it. So we talk about the bureaucratic issues, Michael Waxman going up and down the big organization, and the viability of a small organization to deal with the delays and the slow sales cycle. So it's also the cultural defense that adds time. Okay, let's move on. Does anybody want to talk about the impact of tax and HR issues on selecting appropriate entities? I think that's a detail which is fairly complicated. We can all discuss that afterwards. So let's move on to human resources management.
Did you have a question or comment?
I was just going to mention The Economist had several articles dealing with this. They highlighted Ireland, 12% corporate tax. And I think the US really, if we want to retain manufacturing technology, really has to think seriously about the competitive nature of corporate taxes. I met with the technology attaché for a European country that's drawing huge pharma manufacturing resources to their country. They dropped their corporate tax rate from 32% to 2%. We're losing all of those jobs. J&J is anticipated to cut something like 3,000 jobs this year. I mean,
Okay.
I think this is an issue for taxes.
Yeah, it's a policy issue.
So let me, for those of you in the back who could not hear this, we have a question about what are we doing in the United States regarding taxation when our rates are so much higher. And of course, the French and the Germans and Spanish are not too happy about the Irish who've got the 12.5% max tax rate for technology companies. and the deal where Apple has $1 billion in offshore assets accumulated from revenue that have not come back on shore because the Irish have been able to use that as a center for not only employment of thousands of programmers, but also for licensing and receipt of royalties at reduced withholding taxes and virtually nil or very low Irish taxes. So that's the case of forum shopping. And so we have our issues are, is it more valuable to you to go forum shopping in the United States because of the implicit knowledge that we have or the experience in the marketplace that we have versus going to some place which is distant, inconvenient, or inappropriate for your business. So there's a political question and also a commercial question, how do you go properly forum shopping? And I happen to like forum shopping a little bit, but remember one thing about it, it only works if it is properly structured, it's honest and transparent, and meets all the requirements, and performs a valid business function with real local people. Letterbox companies don't work anymore. Okay, moving on to human resources before we close. Any comments on human resources issues and strategic alliances?
I mean, I would like to give an example because I also don't want you or any of us to leave the room with this, how to put it, malaise. You know, there are a lot of issues and cultural nuances. You know, they're different. They're not necessarily better or worse. You know, we have a 12-year-old relationship with an Indian, two Indian companies, and we've outsourced, so to speak, because we don't want to have our own legal entity in India at this point and manage this. But we have worked together for 12 years. I started this company and we've worked together for 3 years. You have to be an early bird. We get up at 6 a.m. or we have our product meetings at 6 a.m. in the morning, so it helps that I'm a morning person. But in general, it's worked beautifully. We can do things. We can build, iPad apps or Android apps at a price point that make us competitive in this market that we could never do. And they're incredibly talented, dedicated teams. They're really nice to work with. Are there cultural issues? Yes. It took us years until somebody would ever say no to me. I cannot do something. Because it's culturally not accepted, right? The head person in the office gets copied on every email. And he has 150 people. I would not want his email inbox. So there are cultural issues, right, managing HR, but I wanted to also make a pitch, right? Many of us enjoy personally all those relationships around the world. We like, the cultural experience, but there are also real business advantages, right? I mean, we've done technology companies in Israel are phenomenal. There's talent there that you can almost not find in the US outside Silicon Valley and maybe a couple of blocks here in New York. So there are real advantages, I think, from a human resource perspective as well business-wise. So I wanted to make that little pitch here in terms of own experience because we all have a sense, right? There are lots of issues in the US or elsewhere when you do business. That's just part of life.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Michael Waxman-Lenz, Michael Youth, and Bill Pierce. And on behalf of the New York Tech Council, I'd like to thank you all for coming. There's a little bit of networking opportunity in the reception area as we complete. And if you'd like to talk with any of the speakers, we're here to talk. We also invite you to think about other topics in the international sector, which may be more specific, more quote practical, more detailed, and those which rather than just doing a tour d'horizon, just an overview. So we invite you to participate. We're looking for new ideas to help you meet the challenges and find some opportunities and grow your companies. Thank you very much.